Hey, a big thank you to Bright Cellars for partnering with me on this video. Hey everyone. So I want to know, do you play the friend or foe game in your garden at this time of year? This is something I did all the time when I was a relatively new gardener, and we moved into this house where there were plants all over the place and I had no idea what any of them were. In fact, I invited my mom over a lot, who's an experienced gardener, to help me figure out, was this a weed or was this a plant? And of course, as you get to know your own garden, you remember, although honestly, I'm starting to forget what's what and what's where, but you kind of have a rough idea. But sometimes you just sort of don't know exactly what's there. Maybe a plant did really well somewhere and you weren't really expecting that, or maybe a plant moved. In any case, I thought it might be kind of helpful to walk around, identify some plants at this really baby stage, but also talk through some of the ways you can tell whether something might be a plant or might be a weed. Before we get started, I'll just say that I don't feel like plant apps, plant identifier apps are particularly helpful at this stage, except for some. We've got a few plants that are really obvious that they would probably catch on to. But for the most part, I don't find that plant ID apps are that helpful at all, other than to confirm what you suspect a plant might be, or to just sort of remind yourself. Like sometimes you'll snap a plant and like 3 things will come up, and if you've already planted something there, you might remember and recognize what one of those are. But definitely not very helpful at these sort of baby stages. So let's take a walk around and go look at some baby plants and try to figure out what's a weed and what's a plant. So now plants that come up like this with really interesting colored foliage in a nice big clump, you're pretty sure that this is going to be a plant and not a weed. And this is one, it's up a little bit farther, so it's easy to recognize this one. This is Mertensia virginica, which is Virginia bluebells. Not a lot of weeds are going to have like super pretty foliage color or come up in clumps. And if you look around, we've got some additional clumps around here. So that sort of helps you figure out what that might be. So if you didn't know what this plant was, you could probably assume that it is a plant and not a weed, simply because it's got such an organized structure and an interesting foliage color. So like I said, sometimes you really have to just get right in there. And here we've got, I think these are some little daffodils growing here, but next to it, do you see these tiny little kind of star-shaped guys? Okay, they're all over. You can see they stretch through here and they thread over there. And this is, you know, a sign potentially that this might be a weed, because it's sort of doing what weeds do, which is run all over. And if you look even over here, they go all the way over here. So there's quite a bit of this around here. And this is maybe a weed or maybe a plant, depending on how you think of this. This is actually sweet woodruff, but it would be very difficult for me to know that if I didn't know that sweet woodruff was running kind of wild through this part of the garden. So if I found this in my garden and didn't know that this was sweet woodruff, I would just let this be and keep a close eye on it. And that's sort of my advice when you're dealing with these things, is that take a look at things. If you're not sure what's a weed and what's a plant, then make a note of it and revisit it in a little bit when it's got some leaves, and it might be a little easier to identify. The other thing you can find out is that sometimes you might think something's a weed, dig it out, and it actually comes out with like a formed root ball, perhaps as though it came out of a plant container. If you do that and it's actually a plant, you can always pop it right back in the ground again. And then you see these little brown leaves popping up everywhere. And when I first moved into this house, these were everywhere, including all over the grass, and I could not figure out what they were. Well, these are trout lilies. And one way to figure that out is that you see these little spots on it, which is very easily identifiable. This is a native here, and they're all over. They take a very long time to flower, so I don't see flowers that often, but they're everywhere. They're an ephemeral. They don't interrupt or interfere with anything. They're quite pretty. I let them do their thing here. So those are all growing through here. Now, what is this? What the heck? It's a bottle of wine. Now, if you don't have this great perennial that produces wine growing in your gardens, you can go to Bright Cellars. So Bright Cellars is a subscription wine service that is a ton of fun because you fill out a really short quiz and then they match you with wines, and you have one chance to swap out a couple of wines if something doesn't sound like you'd like it. And then you sort of forget about it, and a few days later, this box appears. Now these are wines that you're probably not going to be able to find at a wine store because Bright Cellars has specialty wines that are exclusive to them. So one of the things I really love about Bright Cellars is that it pushes you outside of your comfort zone. So if you are already a wine drinker, you might be like me and just buy the same bottles of wine over and over and over again, and you might be missing out on something great. So for instance, this month I got a rosé in my box. Now I am not a rosé wine drinker, but I don't know that I've ever actually even tried rosé. So how do I know that I don't like it? So now I'm going to give this a shot. And what's really nice is that every bottle of wine has a wine education card that comes with it. So on the back of that card, it will tell you what the flavor profile is. I can aim myself towards wines that might have a similar flavor profile if I really love this. Now, if I didn't like it, guess what? There's a guarantee. If you hate your bottle of wine, they're going to replace it for free. And if you're not a wine drinker, this is a really good way to just kind of get a feel for what kinds of wine you enjoy drinking by trying a bunch of them. Now, if you're smart, you plan your Bright Cellars delivery for a time when you might be entertaining, and then you open up all the bottles and you let everybody try something, and you can all talk about what you like and what you don't like, and undoubtedly someone's going to like the same thing as you and someone's going to really not like the same thing as you, and it's just kind of interesting to hear what other people think about the same wine. Bright Cellars does the hard part of matching and sourcing wines for you and delivers them straight to your doorstep. You can choose from 12 different plant options and get wine from more than 80 regions around the world. Now, if you've not found any wine bottles growing in your garden, you can give Bright Cellars a try, and they're going to give you $100 off your subscription. So check the link in the description to use that, take the quick quiz, and get your first box on the way today. This time of year, you might have to really look closely to try to get an idea for what a plant might be or what's growing somewhere. And if you look right here, you see this tiny little kind of red ball coming up. Now again, we've got a lot of color there, which would be unusual for most weeds, and it's quite an interesting form. And this is actually rhubarb that's coming up. And next door to it, I have another plant with a developed leaf on it. So you can see what that looks like. Now here, let me put my finger there so you get an idea of how big this is. It's quite tiny, but look beyond this. Do you see this right here? This is Creeping Charlie coming up. So we've got weeds and plants. So one way that I think is a good way to start thinking that something might be a weed or not is to look around, and you can see there is not a lot of green happening in these beds. We've got some daffodils coming up. Obviously, we've still got a lot of leaves and foliage left that haven't been cleaned out at this point, but there is some noticeable green in this bed, and that's right here. And when you see something that is nice and green with some pretty well-formed leaves, and there's not that happening in a bed, that might make you think that this is a weed, which indeed this is. This is garlic mustard weed. And once you start to get familiar with garlic mustard weed, you'll spot it pretty early on. It's got kind of a dark green color, very heavily veined leaves, kind of serrated leaves. You might think this is something like a lady's mantle or something like that, but it's not. And it will come up in these tiny little clumps like this. So that is one that should go for sure. And like I said, garlic mustard weed, if you have a little of it, you probably have a lot of it. So you'll begin to become very familiar with it in all its forms. But of course, that's far from a rule, because here we have a plant that is quite green, but that's because this plant is mostly evergreen. And this is Geranium Mackerizum, which is a ground cover that I talk about all the time. So you've probably heard me talk about it, but this is what it looks like. Now, these leaves are really well formed because, like I said, it's mostly evergreen. So if you put this through a plant app, it would probably be able to recognize this right away. But you can see it's all throughout this area. I knew I had planted it here, obviously, but if you didn't know and you were just coming to this garden fresh, you would be able to identify that pretty easily. In particular, because these leaves are so well formed, you would be able to probably figure this out even through like a simple Google search. So this garden, again, doesn't look like much, but you look down here and you see there's a bunch of like wiry old stems, which can be helpful in identifying things. And you might take a little root around and figure, well, what is this? Is this a weed that wasn't pulled last year, or is this a plant? And there is a tiny little suggestion of what this is right here. So this tiny little leaf is lady's mantle, Alchemilla mollis. And if you know that plant, you know it has these beautiful serrated leaves, but they're all folded up when they come out. So that is what you're seeing right there. So that would be a good sign to help you figure out what this plant is. But also, you know, if you see this kind of foliage around something, like dead foliage, all these stems, like either this was a really big weed or this was a plant. Now next to this, we've got something, again, weed or plant. Well, not something I planted, something that grew here. This is a type of carex. I don't know what kind. It planted itself here. If I didn't want it here, I would dig it out. But it's definitely coming up through the roots of a heucherella right here, which you can see little orange leaves coming up there. So, you know, maybe you wouldn't want this. And if I wanted to get rid of this weed, I would dig this and the heucherella up, and then I'd tease that carex out of there and save the heucherella. Okay, here's a tale of two plants, one that you want and one that you probably don't want, that look really similar. So this right here, fuzzy leaves, this is mullein. And mullein, I mean, some people want it. It can get very weedy. I usually pull it. I might leave one stand here and there, but I know that it will seed all over the place. If I do, it gets these very tall, spiky flowers, kind of yellow, that you might like the looks of and you might not. They're real wild looking. So this is mullein right here. And you can tell it grows with these fuzzy leaves. Now let me show you a look-alike. Over here is Stachy's Byzantine, which is lamb's ear. And look, same fuzzy leaves, same color of leaf, a little bit more organized than the mullein, and a little bit sort of more refined looking, but for the most part, very close looking. So you could easily end up pulling one out instead of the other, or leaving one that you didn't want. So this is one that you might want to watch both if you didn't know for sure, but be on the lookout for plants that look like weeds and weeds that look like plants. They're both all plants, of course, but one might be more desirable than another. Now some plants are so crazy looking, they only look like themselves. And you definitely know exactly what this plant is, and a plant app I'm sure would tell you what this is. And this crazy looking thing is Butterbur. It is absolutely gorgeous at this stage. I mean, I just think that is the coolest looking plant. They're very cool plants. They get huge. The fact that such an enormous plant comes out of this tiny little rosette is shocking. They get leaves the size of like tractor seats. They're huge and they're cool and they're sort of dinosaur looking plants, but they can take over. I think you need to know your area. In my area, they're not going to like really take over. They're going to fill in semi-aggressively. I will be able to keep them in check, but this is one, you know, that comes with a big flashing caution sign to do a little bit of research before you think about planting it. But if you have it, you will know exactly what you have, because nothing looks like this in spring. So if you're new to a gardening space or new to gardening and you're sitting there going, what is a plant and what is a weed? Don't worry about it. First of all, know that everybody goes through that. And when you come to a new property, it is extraordinarily confusing to figure out. And over time, you will get to know what's what. But these are some of the things that you can kind of look for to help identify what's what. And remember, there's never any harm in waiting unless you forget to get back to it. So if you're ever in doubt, just let it grow a little bit more and you'll see what it is. Now, this is particularly important when it comes to reseeding annuals. Take some time. I mean, it's very easy to accidentally weed out a whole bunch of self-sown poppies, for instance, because they're tiny. You don't really know. And all plants sort of look the same when they're coming up from seed. So give things a little bit of time. But I hope you got a few tips here to how to identify, generally speaking, if a more developed plant is something you want in your garden or something you don't want in your garden. All right, thank you for watching. Happy weed hunting.